and Blum, he's a theoretical computer science, so he's not a neuroscience scientist. And this is not, I wouldn't say it's a really biologically accurate model. What he's trying to do is create a well-defined formal model, basically mathematical model that you can use to basically define the minimum level of consciousness and to be able to explain subjective experience like pain. And he focuses on pain primarily, but there's some other emotions him and his wife kind of talk about. And he hopes that the model will help explain the difference between simulation from experience, which would be helpful in like a hospital situation. It would be very bad if we're giving anesthesia to all these people and they're not really unconscious. They're feeling it, but they just don't remember it. So it'd be nice to have a test for that. So he has a very specific definition of consciousness. It's what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you feel, and he especially focuses on inner speech. He thinks that you're not really conscious if you don't have subvocalizations going on. See here. Yeah, and like I said, it's a simplified model. It's for this the overarching part here. And he's asking the question, can a machine be conscious? And he would answer, yes, it can, and that it can have free will, pain, joy, and is aware of itself and its surroundings. And that it can actually experience qualia and not just simulate it. And I'm curious what you guys think. I know some people think that simulating is the same as experiencing. I disagree, but any thoughts?
I always wonder on that question, how would you know or determine the difference?
Well, he says one measure would be whether unanticipated circumstances, or let's say appropriate feelings of, say, pain and joy. So maybe if you do something and that it's never seen before, and it experiences, it says that it experiences joy, or is it similar to how humans would respond in a similar situation? I know you could program a robot to simulate and act like it experiences these things, but I think there's a distinct difference between simulation and experience. I mean, at least for a human, we can act like we've experienced pain. We can be an actor, but the actual experience of pain is much, much different.
It strikes me in the video, in a later section, he talks about an example of a person who has no fear. Her amygdala, I think it was, is frozen effectively, and that she had to learn and train herself to like cautiously cross the street and things like that. So
yeah.
You would put that in context here. You would think consciousness pain and fear are sort of a similar thing, but she effectively is programmatically experiencing fear.
Yeah, and he would say that emotion is not necessary for consciousness because of all these examples of people that can't feel pain or fear or different emotions, and yet they still seem to be conscious. And I'll go over a list of things later that he thinks are necessary for consciousness. But his hypothesis is basically it doesn't need to be biological, can be a computer program, and it's the architecture of the program that's what's important. And I think it's this. I think it's the center one. It can be a computer program, or maybe is a computer program in humans that people get hung up on. I believe it is. I don't know if you can convince someone that it is. I'm curious what you guys think. Any thoughts?
Well, I think there are, some aspects of human existence which can't be run on a computer, but otherwise, the consciousness that I'm interested in is an awareness of what I'm thinking or what I'm doing and stuff like that. So I think that can be run on a computer.
Yeah.
And also learning from experience.
Yeah, I mean, from my knowledge of, of neuroscience and whatnot, the reason why I think it can be a program is just everywhere you look, you see programs, basically. V1 visual cortex, you see edge detectors. That can be, you can do that with program. Head direction cells, those are fairly straightforward. Place cells, grid cells. These seem to have, somewhat interpretable functionality that can be done on a computer. I don't know of specific examples where it's theoretically impossible to write a program to not be able to do it. Maybe someone else.
What was your last statement? I missed that.
Oh, I don't know of specific examples about functionality in the brain that cannot be created via a computer program or simulated via a program.
Well, you know them, you just dismiss them for some reason.
Can you give an example?
Well, what is the experience Blue?
Of what? Of Blue?
What is the experience of Blue that we have? Why do we have that experience?
I have some ideas I was going to get into later, but I don't know if you're familiar with sparse distributed representations at all. I'll get into that later.
You know what?
How about the unknown?
The unknown?
Yeah.
Like
write a program.
Like confidence, not confident in some surprise.
Whatever's unknown is something you have never experienced before, never encountered before.
Yeah.
How do you write a program to accurately capture that? Because that's what we do.
I know.
How did humans respond to that?
Yeah. What we do using our consciousness is to learn. So the empirical evidence of a lack of consciousness in that case would be an inability to encounter novelty.
Or
inability
to.
Yeah.
That's how we can encounter novelty. That's where it arises. So
yeah.
that would be my way of distinguishing a function for consciousness, which might have a few empirical teeth.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Go ahead.
Oh, I have a suggestion. Maybe we should go through the slides first, and then we can kind of assemble what Blum's system is.
Okay.
And then we can comment. What do you guys think of that? I don't know.
It's all good.
Or we could talk about each slide. It's basically it's up to you. But I personally work a little bit better if I first get the a reasonably complete overview.
A little bit of both. How's that?
Oh, okay. I just wanted to.
I'll go. Maybe I'll go through a few and then.
Keep the comments short during the presentation.
Okay. So yeah, his goal is to find a Turing machine, most simple, and yeah, he makes a distinct separation between human consciousness and robot consciousness, and he he's not saying he understands human consciousness. He's just trying to figure out robot consciousness, and in the hopes that there might be a bit of overlap. And it's based on the global workspace theory by Bernard Bars. His is kind of an extension of this theory. And the main analogy with the global workspace theory is that you have a theater where consciousness is the actors on the stage, and that's your short-term memory. Whereas the observers, the audience, are your huge set of unconscious processors, and that's your long-term memory. And each processor knows about other processors, and they can communicate, and they're in close contact. And the short-term memory is extremely small compared to the long-term memory. And here's an example, well, visual, where you have your unconscious processors, and they're kind of competing to get into this global workspace, this conscious area. And once there, they continually broadcast their information to all of the unconscious processors. And this is kind of the meat of it, where it's this flow into the conscious, or into the global workspace, and this constant, this constant, broadcasting. And I find it kind of interesting. I mean, when we talk to ourselves, it seems like, why are we talking to ourselves all the time in our head? It seems like there's an audience when we're talking, and according to this, there is. And here's a more in-depth visual. This is a global workspace theory. Blum's theory removes this central executive, which acts like a, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with this theory, but I think it acts like a finite state machine. And then you have all your, unconscious processors at the bottom: perceptual memory, autobiographical memory, visual knowledge, declarative knowledge, and whatnot. And Blum is saying, yeah, it's this tiny short-term memory, and he focuses on the number of chunks. Like, there's only about 7 plus or minus 2 chunks that we can be aware of at any one time, and chunks are defined pretty loosely. I mean, you could think of them like a number. Number might be a chunk, letter, an idea, an object, something like that, a thing. You can only have a very, very small set of these things in memory at any one time. And then you have that huge long-term memory in the constant broadcast. And yeah, the long-term processors are basically negotiating among themselves, trying to kind of compete to get their information into the short-term memory. And he talks about what we are conscious. We're conscious of this short-term memory, but we're also conscious a little bit from our external input, our senses. So, but not as much as you might think. So, like vision. Here's an example. This is actually what you see. If you notice, there's a high-resolution spot on the kind of bottom middle left. And there are people that they see. This is actually what they see. They see their whole visual field, and most of it's blurry. And you have one high-resolution spot because some damage to part of their brain. But the rest of us just fill it in. So yeah, we are conscious of some of our external input and some of our external output. And he gives the example of wiggling your ears. Like if you try to wiggle your ears, you don't really know if you did unless you like look in the mirror or something, or some. You give an action, and there's a delay. Then you sense whether that action actually happens or not. And he gives the other example of like, kids try to be like Yoda and make an object move. You can put your brain to move an object, and you actually you have to see it in order to know whether it really moved. Yeah. So this one example he gives with these processors is the idea. Say you're at a party and you want to remember someone's name, and your short-term memory sends out a broadcast saying what is her name, and every processor takes this, and most of them don't know what it is, but there might be one that says, oh yeah, it starts with I don't know, an R, and sends that information back up to the short-term memory, and that information gets broadcast to all the other processors, and then you might have another processor that says, oh yeah, that's Rachel, and so now you have the processor, the one that responded to the question, they start forming links, and these are unconscious links to each other. It's the idea of going from, conscious skills to unconscious, like muscle memory. Or if you play ping pong, you're very conscious in the beginning when you're learning ping pong, but over time it becomes more and more unconscious. And he's saying that's because more of these links are being created while you're learning. Okay. And this, he's saying in his model, he's using pointer, like every chunk is actually a pointer to one of the processors. I don't think there's a neural correlate to that, but maybe there is, I don't know. But that's his model. So,
hey Lance, what was the FSM? Sorry, I was writing something down, and
finite state machine. Yeah. So it can send, it can point to, I guess, each chunk can point to another chunk or one of the processors. And he's saying that the broadcasting is extremely fast. He sets it as a binary tree. In the brain, it's not really, you have tons of recurrent things. But to simplify the model, he just creates a tree. It goes down very, very fast and goes up slowly. And you do have very specialized processors in the brain. There's a part of the brain that specializes in faces, one for speech, one for fine motor control, many different. And his thing, so when he talks about like the subjective experience of pain, he says that each one of these might have a feeling, a weight to it. So pain might have a weight of, say, -5. And his analogy is what we have in our body is fibers, I think nociceptive fibers, nerve fibers, where it's the frequency of the firing and the amount of firing that kind of is the signal of our pain. And as these weights go up the tree, he's saying you might have like joy and that they add up, but it's the one with the highest magnitude that keeps going up. And so like since fear is higher magnitude than pain, fear would go all the way top. And he's saying that this kind of gives you, at the top, it gives you a sense of the overall positive, negative feeling. And once it's at the top, in the short term, the weights start falling again, so it's easier for other processes to take its place. And he gives the example of Oliver Sacks. He's a neuroscientist, author, and he was taking a walk one day where he came to a fence. There was a sign that said "Beware of bull," and he went in anyways. And there was a bull, and it was about to charge him. So he was scared out of his wits, started running, extremely scared. And it wasn't till later that he realized that he had torn a bunch of ligaments and that he was in extreme pain. But he didn't feel that pain. The pain happened, the fear was overriding the pain. And it was only until the fear, magnitude of the fear went down that the pain was able to get in. And he also said that these processors send their weights, and we are somewhat conscious of the weights, and we're also conscious of the information that is sent up. And he's saying these are like the gist of a scene, he says. So when you remember some image or something, you're kind of just remembering the gist of it. It's not as high resolution as, say, a lucid dream or actually looking at something. He also thinks, well, these the pointers at the top we're not conscious of.
Can I just ask a clarifying? So this makes, I like these charts, but it makes it seem like there's one top, but is like the short-term memory at the top, is that there's like 7 plus or minus 2 of short-term memory?
Yeah, he said there's actually, for every chunk, he said there's another tree. And actually there's a whole tree going down and a separate tree for signals going back up. But he's just simplifying all of that.
Yeah, so this is like one, and all these same modules at the bottom may also be rolling up to another STM in parallel.
Yeah, I think
That's
so.
the way to look at it.
Yeah, massively parallel. And I think he doesn't talk about it at all, but I think there's a lot of cycles at the bottom. I mean, think about like when you have a song stuck in your head. That's a cycle. That's a loop somewhere. And he's saying that the input doesn't go directly to short-term memory. It goes to a processor first. And then back into short-term memory. And also short-term memory doesn't go directly to action or output. But that also comes from processor. So that's, I'm thinking, yeah, probably why consciousness is slower, because you have to do up and down versus unconscious, much quicker. So there's some interesting things come out of this where if you have like a threshold for the weight, first of all, any questions on that?
Yeah, I had my microphone off.
Sorry.
I guess I thought it was, hopefully I wasn't mumbling thinking it was off now. Anyway, but so I just noticed, so he essentially equates each of these unconscious processors with its own memory store, it looks like. So so I get the feeling that he's got, so the speech processor has its own memory, or is the memory shared in this model?
Yeah, that's not. it's a little unclear.
Yeah, it is a.
I think there's a little bit of, I think it's a performs computation, and that computation uses its own memory, maybe. Like a little program or something. Any other questions on that?
There doesn't appear to be any attention system in this.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, these pointer things he's talking about.
The attention is that doesn't it come out of that weighting of the fear and he's got that if you have a fear of 10 and a joy of 11 or something, then it sounds like more weight would be assigned to whatever. I mean, the attention would be assigned to whatever process won out in terms of that emotional valence.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the low number of chunks that can go into there. Basically, you're attending to whatever is in that short-term memory. Yes.
The processors are all kind of fighting for attention amongst themselves, right?
Yeah, they're fighting for access to this memory.
But no, they're
There's a box in the lower left that says, I'm assuming that's self-awareness.
Yeah, self-awareness is one.
And the far right, it's slightly chopped off as well. That's just context.
Yeah, he says there's a processor that kind of, it's usually in short-term memory that kind of tells your context, where you are in the world, what you're doing, but that can be turned on when you're really thinking, like you're really thinking about something. You sometimes forget where you are, and so that can be taken over if you really need the processing power.
But I didn't see the bottom layer as in competition to themselves. Those are parallel systems.
They're parallel. I think.
And they're processing input, and then the results of their processing are being filtered up to the short-term memory or through intermediate nodes.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily, like, memory on the left is not, the way you listed it as all memories makes it deceiving, but I didn't see that layer as in competition, because it's all physical, emotional, mental, sensual. There's processes that handle all that input.
Yeah, I think some things he thinks are maybe more in competition, like fear and joy or something.
But that's the result.
I can imagine a lot of scenarios where there's several of these occurring in parallel.
Yeah,
First
yeah.
state, you've got fear, desire, embarrassment, speech, faces all happening at the same time.
I guess I saw the competition as the output from these processes as they move up. Then it's the weightings that is the competition of who gets the attention of the short-term memory.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the competition it's information. It's a big information bottleneck. Like these are sending. But yeah, you can look at a face and talk and be afraid at the same time. But your focus is going to be, I think, more on one than the other. I mean, you could probably have a few at the same time. But
well, no, I was saying the focus. You're right. The focus on one or the other, but that's based on the weight that filters up. But underneath the bottom layer, those are still all processing somewhat in parallel.
Yeah.
Even though, maybe your facial recognition is the one that will be predominant in the short-term memory.
Yeah, I think all of these can be running pretty much almost all the time, and only some of them you're aware of at any one time. I almost look at the short-term memory as a sentence or something, like you have objects and you have relationships, And he doesn't talk about relationships much, but I think those are just as important as objects. The man is walking down the street. I want to go to the store. When I say I want to go to the store, I think that's broadcast everywhere, and it creates a program almost dynamically, right there, where they're all coordinating to get me to walk to the. So I need to figure out what I need. I'm planning. So a lot of this short-term, it's all about like long-term planning. You can't really plan without it. And I was going to talk about this later, but there is the idea of people whose corpus callosums have been severed, the different parts of the brain, and they go to the grocery store, they pick out some broccoli, and one hand will grab the broccoli, put it in the cart, the other hand put it in the cart and put it back. It's basically that they have two people. They ask them a question, and they write one thing, and they say something else. So how I view this is that this statements or questions that occur up here in the short-term memory, and they're broadcasted, they kind of orient every processor to that. But if you don't have that orientation, they can diverge, and they become multiple personalities almost.
So how do we interpret the light green lines that lead to the external output box?
Well, so like
because I would expect that your short-term memory would be an intermediary to the output.
Well, I don't think it is like if you touch a hot stove and you instantly react. I think I forget the actual neural pathway.
Oh, that's what it's. The input is coming in. The output is the red arrows going up to the short-term memory. Green arrow go down to the speech.
Actuation.
And then the actuation is the output.
Okay.
So the input is like a hot stove. It goes through this, and the green arrow output is shit.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it has to be.
I was thinking of a different scenario where you need food and you're hunting, or you need to hunt for food, but your fear overcomes your desire, or vice versa, right? So there's some competition that leads you to action. Yeah.
He had an example like that in another paper where he talked about like the overriding up arrow was hunger, and that drove out everything. So then it populates down to say I need food, and the module say, well, we don't have any food, so it populates back up, but now the next urgent goal is find food, and it becomes a new search pattern. And so he sort of described that as how the goal setting stems from still an initial overwhelming priority of hunger, but it then nests into problem solving until you address that initial hunger fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of them can.
There were also
Sure,
some arcs in long-term memory from LTM to another section of LTM. Some red arcs. LTM is doing something.
Those are the connections between the different processors. So they're talking amongst themselves also.
In this model, it sounds like that would be totally unconscious. Those red arcs down.
Yes,
at the bottom.
those are totally unconscious. So once you learn a skill or something, that's what's happening mainly, is the communication between these unconscious processors. Once you learn it well. And he talks about there being a threshold. The weight has to be certain, high enough to get into the short-term memory. And if you set the weight too low, this is too much bubbling of it. Ideas will come in, and then another one, and that's, he says, is mania. Mania is just lots of ideas, but none of them thought out very well. Whereas if the bar is too high, no ideas are getting in, and you get depression, lack of ideas, lack of motivation. Yeah, and I talked about how the links form when one kind of answers the call of another. Um, and so pain, I think thought this is kind of interesting, is an actor that takes over all of short-term memory, prevents all other actors from reaching the stage. Pain messages and only pain messages are broadcast. Every processor knows of the pain. So it's kind of he's saying pain is a taking over of the system. And I've never heard that before. That kind of makes sense. Like, again, if you're in pain, you can't play chess very well. You can't do much. And the more extreme it is, the less you can think of other things. You have to focus on this pain because it seems to be taking over everything and interrupting all the processors. And he's saying confirmations. I kind of talked about that, where people that don't feel pain can play a game of chess, where those that do and they're feeling pain cannot. And he says, by Darwinian design, you could expect that pain should lead to a constructive thinking, but it doesn't. It inhibits constructive thinking. And I think anger, especially extreme anger, also inhibits constructive thinking. It forces you to rely on your unconscious self. I assume that's because unconscious is faster, and you need to be fast when you're in pain or angry. Thoughts?
Hey, well, this is kind of like an old-fashioned computer interrupt. So something happens external to the machine, and then it has to take action. But he's describing it as painful. So so take a CPU, and then suppose 4 interrupts happen. Which one do you pick? According to this model, if I've got it right, the CPU would pick the one that would cause the most pain. So that's how this model would sort out which interruption to attend to. So it makes sense. I mean, it's based on psychology, not necessarily logic.
Sure.
Well, this is saying under cases in an event of extreme pain, that's just going to get your attention. I mean, you're not going to do anything else other than attend to the pain in some way. You're not going to be able to think clearly about other things. But I disagree that that's the hard problem. There's another sense of experience that, actually what we feel when we feel pain at all. That's the hard problem.
Why do we feel pain at all?
Yeah. Why not just read numbers or something?
Why not what?
Why do we have the experience of pain? I think that's the hard problem. It's different than just being aware of pain or reacting, or focusing your attention on the pain. There's more to it than that. So I agree with what he's saying here. It makes sense to me. So
I think what he's also leaving out is when we feel pain, there's a lot of changes in the body and whatnot, sweat and constriction of muscle, and so we're sensing all of that also. So yeah.
So there's a fundamental change in the processing that takes place at the experience of the machine, the conscious Turing machine experiencing pain. It sounds like it kind of lost my point there, but I mean, so.
Well, I was just thinking about this. If I think the human explanation is not that complicated when you consider evolution, right? So those organisms that experience pain are protective of their injury and are more likely to survive and avoid future circumstances that might cause pain and are more likely to survive. And in the computing robotics field, maybe if you devised a evolutionary scenario where some signal encouraged the algorithm to avoid dangerous situations, i.e. pain, along with the memory that goes along with it, maybe you could ultimately replicate it.
Yeah.
I had the same point. In humans, pain is related to mortality, it's survivability. And conversely, what would pain be in an AI, an AGI? You know, what is mortality to an AGI that could conceivably be rebooted?
Well, yeah. I think in terms of the hard problem, in terms of the actual feeling of pain, he would say it's the architecture of that system. It's and the change of focus.
Yeah, but we all experience pain differently. So you could, and it's hard, it's almost impossible to say how a human feels pain is not any different from a programmatically computed pain. So you could have like a AI on a battery system that feels pain when the battery gets down to 5%.
Yeah.
And that could be pain to a computer-based system. And how is that different than hunger or something?
That's what I disagree with. I don't know how to argue that, but I just totally disagree with it. But learned pain is interesting. Jim was talking about that. You could learn the computer could learn to feel pain for some event that it's not instinctive, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the biological system, pain, part of the job of pain is to, tell our nervous system and our kind of healing system to direct blood to an area and direct other things to start a healing process that doesn't necessarily apply in an AI or robotic situation.
Yeah. I don't think we'll ever probably get it exactly like a human pain. I mean, there's so much going on there. I don't know if we want to. I don't know. I'm not sure if we want to create machines that feel pain. I mean, he's saying that that it might be nice so that they, for self-preservation, but you can use pattern recognition also for self.
Well, one thing pain does for humans, at least children, is it provides some form of empathy.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
They learn that it hurts to be bitten, and so they don't bite, whatever.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And so, AI wouldn't necessarily have that form of empathy that, I don't understand why it's a problem for humans to be
Yeah.
hurt badly.
Yeah, maybe if we're trying to do create life, it's not necessary. Here's the list that he's saying is needed for consciousness. And he's saying inner speech or something like it, maybe inner images, touch order, is necessary. Self-awareness, basically an actor representing the entity itself, and motivation. He doesn't know about procedural memory, how to ride a bicycle and whatnot, but he's pretty sure that declarative memory is not needed. He cites that patient H.M., Henry Molaison, I think, who could not create new memories, short-term memories, and he was still conscious. Saying that language is not needed. There are people that can't speak that are conscious. Math is not needed. Emotion and emotions, which is, interesting.
I thought it was interesting that he claimed his dog had inner speech.
Yeah, I thought that too. I'm not completely sold on the inner speech thing. Although this guy, Scott Moss, psychologist, he had a stroke, and the inner speech went away for weeks. He said, I lost the ability to converse with others and to engage in self-talk. In other words, I did not have the ability to think about the future, to worry, to anticipate or perceive it, at least not with words. Thus, for the first 4 or 5 weeks after hospitalization, I simply existed. And does simply existing, is that conscious? I think it might be a matter of definition. my dog just sits around all day. Is he conscious? I think he is.
If he didn't declare blindness, then he's conscious.
Yeah. Yeah.
This reminds me of Lance, when you were telling me about Buddhism. So don't you one goal is to cut off that speech, right? I mean, so
Yeah. Well, it's kind of,
so you can almost simulate this, and then if after you simulated it, then decide, am I still conscious?
yeah. Yeah. Maybe there's drugs that can do it.
Well,
It
one
could be
definition is consciousness
Get a hangover though.
is that emptiness within which thoughts emerge, right? And so he experienced that emptiness, for a long period of time, which an expert meditators only hope for.
Yeah. I'm mainly interested in like qualia, because that to me is the hard part. Like why do we see and everything seems bright and colored? What is that? What's happening there? This was kind of interesting. There's people that experience, it's called left hemispatial neglect, where they lose the motivation to see the left part of the vision. And they don't see it. They're not conscious of it anymore because they don't have the motivation to see it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I thought motivation was an interesting choice of words for that.
Now, so I'm curious to know what the physiological issue here was. Did they specifically put half of the brain to sleep, or is this something that developed?
No, this is a condition you have, some people have. I think neurologically the visual part is still functional, but it's like, I don't know. I guess they say the motivational part.
Can explain a little bit about what's
Sure.
going on. I mean, if you drew a line down vertically through your eyes, each eye, the left and the right side, are independent, and in the chiasma in the middle of the brain, where all the wiring swaps over and merges, it turns it into a complete left field and a complete right field. So if you have a physiological problem with the signal transmission on the left half of your eyes, it's really weird, then it can actually just simply be lost in the, I think it's the lateral geniculate nucleus, the LGN, which is part of the thalamus. And so it's kind of an inability to attend to the left half of the visual stream.
Or maybe the left part of the optic chiasma?
Yeah, that bit.
But I thought the left half of the visual was controlled by the right side of your brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it crosses over in the optic chiasm.
It's also upside down. I mean, the whole thing's a bit of a mess, but that's what it looks like when the patient reports their experience.
There was a popular book a few years ago, I think it's called Brain on Fire, where she has a infection in the brain, and this was one of the key diagnoses that identified. Like, she was seeking treatment, and everyone said nothing's wrong, but when the doctor had her do this test, that was the first clue of what was going on.
Yeah, how about that? Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, I talked about SM is another patient, and she had complete bilateral amygdala calcification due to a genetic condition, and she basically had no fear, except for some exceptions. Or one main exception, she experienced fear and panic of greater intensity than in response to simulated suffocation via carbon dioxide inhalation. Interesting. But yeah, she didn't feel emotion, but she was still conscious. Or she didn't feel fear. This other patient, Caleb, felt no emotion or couldn't describe them also conscious.
Yeah, it's curious that he excludes emotions. He says that's not a requirement for consciousness, right?
Well, it doesn't seem to be based on these patients.
Yeah, but how does that fit into his system? Because it seems like okay, I'm starting to understand. So um, the emotions seem to travel upward, from the bottom of the processors up to and he doesn't have a central executive, but he's got that short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
But it still seems like the emotions are important in his model.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's saying that emotions aren't important.
It's just not part of consciousness.
Not you don't need it. Yes, I just had some final thoughts. I kind of talked about sparse distributed representations. I was just thinking like, what is sight? How do these processors talk to each other? And I don't know if people have read any, like Jeff Hawkins. He talks about these sparse distributed representations all the time. And if you're not familiar, it's basically you have a few neurons on, and most of them are off. And what that gives you, and these neurons kind of represent features of something. So this could say these ones being on. That's the idea of a dog. You change it a little bit. It's a cat. The ones in common, it could be a dog or a cat. These aren't really sparse because it's almost half are on. I think in the brain it's somewhere like 4% of neurons are on at any one time. But what you get a lot of nice features with the sparse representation. One is just a huge capacity. If you have like 40 neurons on at any one time, out of 1,000, the number of possible combinations there is more than the atoms in the universe. And the likelihood that you pick, one combination up randomly, the likelihood of there being much overlap between two representations is very, very small, negligible. And this, I mean, you could represent anything. You could represent words as far as distributed representations, and you can have a hierarchy of these. So I was thinking, what does it mean to see something? I do meditate a bit, and a lot of this, the senses, I feel are kind of similar to vision. Like if you think about it, I think possibly every sense has is almost like a point cloud of 3D points. Even your inner speech has position. If you think about it, it's right in the center of your head. And maybe that's where some of the sense of self comes from, because we do have a processor that helps distinguish ourself from other things. It can be damaged, and you can lose that distinction. Maybe that creates that sense of self, is that our inner speech that is positioned right there, so within that self area. Sound, positional. Even smell, I think, is positional. But if you're looking at something, just say, if you take a single pixel, you can represent that. So I'm trying to turn the problem around. Like, it is a hard problem. The problem of consciousness is hard to think about. And I think people just say it's just too hard. But I think you have to break it up into specific pieces, like sight, sound, because I think they're all very they're all very complex systems. And there's many parts to each one. And if you just think about what does it mean to see a line, well, each point could be described as a sparse sort of representation, and you can combine those. You have a sparse representation of the whole line, and that can be combined to have with other representation. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but you can create a system. So here's my point: like, if you create a system that can do pattern recognition, can it see? I know we know the pattern. Every pixel we see, we know the position, we know the depth somewhat, we know the color. We also know like the type of thing that it's part of. We know how confident we are of that type of thing. Is that point moving? Is that part of something that's moving? Is it familiar to us? These are all can be, I think, represented using sparse distributed representations, and you can combine them to make a bigger representation. Thoughts?
So I mean, so it's like a superposition of sparse representations that gives you like a single integrated idea. Sounds like.
Yeah, and there's attention. I think attention is a big part of it too. Because you're constantly moving your attention around to different, different stimuli, whether it's internal or external. And that it's yeah, I don't know, but I don't know if that's enough. Like, if you create this system, does it see like we do or not? I don't know.
Well, isn't what you're describing the visual part of the bottom layer? So exactly what you said with the sparse system recognition is, but it's a background process, and then the results of that are filtered up for processing later. So it's the visual recognition is not necessarily processing. I'm hesitant to say a meaning out of it, but it's assessing what the input it's getting, and then it rolls it up. And in your earlier chart, one objection I'd have is that it not in your in the original, the way it presented is that there's lots of summation points along that way. Every time those two lines join, that's sets of inputs being summed, and in his model, new weightings assigned and moved on up. So there's lots of junctions between that lower process and the short-term memory at the top.
And we also know kind of why we could also focus on different layers. So you could look at an object and I could ask you why is it a table? And you could focus on specific edges of the table, you could describe those. So seems like we can move our focus around to the different layers of representation. Yeah. And I think that's what he's talking about a little bit in terms of the pointers. I don't think they use pointers, probably something else.
Yeah, conceptually, a line is a good example because it, in terms of storing what a line is, you don't have to have a whole lot of information. So the concept of a line is it's straight.
Yeah.
And it might have length and thickness and color, and a direction and space. So if you're looking at a table, for example, that's rectangular in nature with straight legs, you remember it as a series of lines, kind of, right? So you could glance at it for just a moment, and you could probably turn around and draw it on a piece of paper because there's relatively few things you had to remember about it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you looked at a table that's carved out of a natural piece of of wood that has irregular edges and a lot of different color patterns or something, you'd have to study it for a while before you were confident that you'd turn around and draw a picture of it.
Sure.
A lot of a lot of different points in those complex lines that you have to store.
Would that mean that we were less conscious before we made artifacts?
Just less skilled, I think.
Less skill, definitely.
It's only artifacts.
Still using our
It's
senses.
only artifacts that have straight lines, squares, and rectangles. You look out in nature and you don't see any straight lines.
True. Well,
Yeah.
not too straight. Trees, trunks, maybe.
There's no such thing as a cross in nature.
But arguably, in pre-artifact time, they were more conscious of the natural world than we are. So there's as much awareness in recognizing, difference in shading of a tree or grass or something as we're attributing to a straight line.
Yeah.
Now, the straightness of things is kind of an artifact of how easy they are to create, right? So you run logs through a saw and they become flat-faced, and then you can build stuff out of it.
I guess what I'm saying is evolutionary would be rather unlikely that it would arise that straightness was an easy thing to remember when it didn't occur.
Maybe.
Well, a lot of these are learned, I think. These representations are learned. I think for the most part. I mean, when babies come out, they can kind of see a face. If you give them 2 points, maybe 3 points, they'll turn their head towards it. But they lose that after a month or so, and then they gain it back. And I think there might be two processes going on. One where you're kind of built in, where you have a built-in kind of recognition of parts of the face, but then you have you learn a much more, full pattern recognition system, or it's a full system to recognize faces.
Yeah, it's quite likely there's a built-in special part of the neurons that is a face recognizer that's built into your brain.
Yeah, I think you can lose that.
Yeah, you can lose that. There's a specific neurological syndrome where you can not recognize faces.
Yeah, face blindness.
I just one file thought, I thought maybe we should be using the royal we now, because if we're just tons of these processors, and that our consciousness is actually kind of divisible if you think about the corpus callosum thing. It seems like we're just many different systems, and I was trying that. We would like to go upstairs now. It works also. Like it does almost feel like a we. Just a thought. Okay, that's all I have.
When in the chart with the short term and the agents at the bottom, I mean, what really strikes me is that system 1, system 2 processing, and the short-term memory, isn't that where that's the spotlight in the global workspace? I mean, that's what we're conscious of, and when we're learning something new, we're working up there. But after we learn to play the piano, the actual action is done, and I don't want to say an unconscious, but a less than. We don't need the spotlight to play the piano or play tennis after we've learned, but we need it intensely at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I like this model because it does seem to map that system 1, system 2 approach.
Yeah. Curious, other thoughts about this entire model?
That's a good point, Ken. I like because on that diagram, yeah, it's got the input just goes down to the unconscious, and then the unconscious can do the output too. So unconsciously, I can see it in the graph.
I like it because
Everything can happen.
oh, go ahead.
Everything can happen in the brainstem as well. It goes all under the brainstem and directly out of the brainstem, and even your cortex or cerebellum or is not aware of it. You know,
There's
like
no real deliberation you see going on in this model, though. Is there? I get so I get the feeling that he does cover a lot of stuff, but that he doesn't really have he doesn't like the idea of the central executive.
Well, he says that it's not needed, that the processors take the role of it.
Yeah, I guess the my concern about that is, like, what if it wants to do some kind of logical reasoning? So, like of the type you might see in ordinary programming. Well, I guess that would be accommodated down in one of the processors.
Or, I mean, if you, I think it has to do with the connections made and the bubbling. So I'm thinking the short-term memory, when we talk, we string words together. These are all kind of part of our short-term memory. And then we're kind of bubbling new thoughts in as it goes. So it's like a recurrent system.
Do you remember what was his justification for omitting the central executive? Maybe that might have been what you just answered.
I don't know if he said it explicitly.
I
don't think
he said it just wasn't needed because you have all these processes
I don't think his theory really explains learning.
It's sleight of hand, though.
Well, I mean, he tried. I like it because he's trying to. I don't see many models that try to give a computational reason for actual subjective experience, like this, like the constant broadcasting thing, and the taking over of the system. I think those could be possible reasons or possible subjective experiences.
But is it really the same as a psychological reason for humans? Why do you learn? And does it come down to, survival, evolutionary, Maslow hierarchy of needs kind of thing? You want to eat, you want a house over your head. You don't have food, how do you get food? Well, you do this. And, solving your programming problem seems very far away from wanting to eat, but it's a continuous nested problem solving there of, this is what if I do this, then I can get this, and money, and if I get money, I can buy food, and I can satisfy that need. So it seems like we want to answer it way down on the end of that line, when in humans we answer it by saying, well, we just want to have our needs met.
Yeah. He does mention like the weights are constantly changing, and that's to meet like homeostasis and whatnot. So all the variables are changing all the time, and that's why things are bubbling up. Yeah.
It almost seemed like when I was listening and looking at the graphs, and that each processor is could be construed as like its own belief. So, I mean, normally when I think of one model of thinking would be your thought is based upon a constellation of beliefs. So if each, in his model, if each processor kind of constituted its own belief, then it's just a slight rearrangement, moving around the furniture on other cognitive architectures. I mean, what I was kind of getting at was that you can kind of associate a belief with a proposition. So if each of the processors were kind of accumulating their beliefs in terms of propositions.
Yeah.
It like in the short-term memory, I guess it was it's still a bit of a question as far as what a chunk was, whether that was it could be seen in terms of a sentence, for example, or whether it was just a single symbol.
Yeah, I
Well,
think. Yeah.
the notion of a chunk, there's a very famous paper, 7 plus or minus 2, which I guess Blum has taken up as well. But it's a very central paper in psychology that goes back to the 1950s or so, which mentions the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks that you can have process in your brain. And if you're very smart, you can handle 9 chunks. And if you're, sort of middling or, 90 IQ, you can maybe get away with 5 chunks.
Mhm.
So more things, more balls you can have in the air, the more phone numbers you can remember, all 9 digits, and you're getting up there.
Yeah, and what I like about this is that there is the machine learning community is also starting to see the benefit of kind of a consciousness prior, a focus on a very small number of things at any one time. I think that kind of reflects reality a bit, where or patterns in nature, where um, you know they're hierarchical, and usually there's multiple parts to most things and multiple relationships. So I think each chunk can be a thing, but that he leaves out relationships, and I think that is just as important. So you have one thing, you can focus on the different relationships that it has with other things that you're also focused on, and then you can kind of zoom in to any one of those, and each one of those has more relation. It's kind of a knowledge graph. And
Yeah, chunk is a recursive object. You can hold 7 plus or minus 2 individual objects, but each of those objects recurse down to a finer and finer level of detail.
It seems like he's from the old school, symbolic orientation. So looking at his design, do you think? I kind of get the feeling that the bottom level, the bottom part of that is sub-symbolic, like and you. Sounds like you have kind of envisioned sparse. I forget what you.
sparse distributed representation.
Yeah, which is basically neural, right?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, with Hawkins'
Mhm.
approach is so. Yeah, so I guess I was thinking in that model, in Bloom's model, that the bottom might be neural, and then up at the top symbols possibly, or is it? Coming from I guess so. Wasn't he like a disciple of Marvin Minsky? And then
Not sure.
no,
Yeah,
those guys tended towards the symbolic orientation,
yeah.
I think. So I don't know. So right now all the talk is
We were
neural
both
symbolic. So
we were both working at MIT for a while.
what?
Bloom was working at MIT for a while.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think he's probably old school, but I mean, so I guess I was thinking we could interpret his model in different ways. So like it's hard to imagine lots of symbols down on the bottom, on that bottom layer, but I don't know. So I mean, a lot of things are going through my mind here about like is a chunk, does it have to be in propositional form, or is it just like when you think red, is that a proposition, like, or is it what is it? So I guess I'm looking at this model. I see a lot of things I like, a lot of ways I'm trying to fit it into some of the things I've seen recently. neural
But
symbolic.
when you see red, I mean, what you perceive is far removed from what you think of as red. In that chart is magnitudes of orders deeper than that. So I saw the bottom of that chart, very neural related. I mean, you're even vision. You know, you're not seeing an image. You're seeing little. You know, each of your retina or can't think of the name of it, but you know, your eye is sensing. Each cell is sensing. You know, light that then is being rolled up and combined into a more meaningful chunk. I'll adopt that, and that just keeps rolling up, and eventually your brain thinks, oh, that's red, but that's a long way from what hits your eye. And that's where I feel like some of these discussions want to start with the computer can't recognize red. Well, and that's my challenge. We don't recognize red. We recognize a whole bunch of stuff and we sum it up as red. I feel that's a stumbling block with the AI discussion.
Yeah. And we pretty much create, we're anticipating it. We're filling in most of it. We're generating most of this because it's, yeah, we only get a small high resolution image.
But even that image, that was my point, even that image, like the streetcar, you get all those pixels, basically. You get little dots of that image and that your eye is absorbing and summarizing. So that's my point, is that the input is at a very, very, very granular level that then gets summed up in multiple layers.
Yeah, if you think about like audio, different frequencies, it's going to, different neurons will, I think, represent different frequencies. And it's this kind of combining these frequencies over time, you'll recognize a note. And then you combine those, and that note can be, say, I think, a sparse representation. Even those frequencies could be a sparse representation. And then you have combining notes over time to get a song, and that song can also be a sparse representation. And you can go back down, you can generate from the top down.
It seems like in Blum's model that, like what Ken was just describing, and it's a really good point. It sounds like that. I mean, so the red that we have, that we eventually get, that's propagated up, it seems like in Blum's model, the red would also be down in one of the processors, but at the bottom of the hierarchy. So it's and maybe that's a weakness of this model. If he's kind of intimating that the symbols off the bottom are the same as the one that propagates up to short-term memory, then it doesn't really meet the kind of requirement that Ken was just describing. Follow me?
I'm not sure I follow.
So basically Ken was saying we've got all of these inputs coming in, and it doesn't come in like when we see a blood or something, the signal as it comes in through through the neural mechanisms, it doesn't register as red until pretty far down the line. So it becomes red eventually. That's what you pretty much just said, right, Ken? Yeah. So okay. So what I'm saying is, in Blum's model, eventually something would be red way up at the top in his short-term memory, right?
Or in that chart, the input is way down below the screen. The raw input is coming up, and what we see in the bottom of the chart is where it eventually becomes the idea of red. And
so I guess what I'm saying is that the whatever red that the Bloom's logical machine registers in its short-term memory is based on what comes in at the bottom. So I guess I'm just a little confused about what I'm sorry. I guess I lost my point. But anyway, maybe you see that. Maybe at least you see the uncertainty involved. About as far as that the machine has to have a number of different inputs that eventually become red. So
yeah, I think
more to think about it.
I mean, he just talks. He doesn't get into that level of detail. I don't think. But he just says there is sensory input and that these processors process it somehow. So red comes in, they process it as red. Probably, you know, that you need a language to talk. They send that info up and down. That, you know.
Well, it doesn't come up as red. That's my point. And to me, it seems actually a real, like, why would you disagree with this idea? You know, you get senses coming in through your vision that eventually said, this is red. You get another sense that comes in through your arm and says, I'm experiencing pain. And a higher level process puts those two together and says, you know, I cut myself and it hurts and I'm bleeding, and you know that keeps going up. So to me, it seems to be a very natural, organic process to go from our input up through that into those kind of ideas and conceptions and eventual, you know, qualia that we treat as ideas and process up the pipeline.
Yeah. What he doesn't talk about is, I don't know, the pattern recognition. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with like predictive coding, where you have input going up and then layers from the higher layers going down to try to predict, I believe, the input and look at the difference between the actual and the expected. When there's a large difference, it modifies weights to reduce the surprise, basically, to everybody. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know how that fits in with this model exactly.
I have one last, and then I'll shut up. But I'll be honest up front, as maybe you can tell from my earlier comment. I firmly believe that AI can be non-biological. Whether we can build it in our lifetime or 1,000 years from now, I won't say. But I think conceptually, it's possible to have a non-organic AI. So that said, that's why I'm fascinated with these topics. But the one thing that always, in the different solutions or theories proposed, that's missing, and it sort of goes to I think Colin's point about the unknown. What's missing is the explanation of like a imagination or creativity, or jumping from the norm or the expected to the unexpected. And I've never seen a model that really says how an artificial intelligence would develop creativity. And I think that's the root of, like Colin's, the unknown point. When you're facing with something you have no idea what it is, there's a random gene that the humans have that says, well, what if we tried this? Or what if we look at that way? And that's how we have been able to advance by filling it, trying to fill in that unknown. And
yeah, and I think
anyway,
that's also missing in terms of like current machine learning is the idea of play and creativity.
Exactly, yeah.
How do you continuously learn?
Most AGIs have a sort of unexpectedness module. So that they'll look at continuous video or audio in stream and oh, that's a strange sound. Oh, that's a strange vision. Orient towards it and figure it out, right? So unexpectedness is an important quality.
Yeah. Tesla found that out when the woman stepped out in the street unexpectedly.
Yeah, a lot of them don't talk about the generative qualities of the brain. Like we dream, we create these images too. And what is the purpose of that? Why do we dream? one idea is that we can explore without actually, explore space without actually really being there. You have a thought, Colin?
I don't think
Yeah, I was just going to say that whenever you think about all of the normal physiological, healthy, experiential scenes, the collections of qualia, for all of the modalities there's the normal, healthy, and then you've got pathological versions of it where things aren't developed right or whether they're being broken by insult or injury. And then you've got imagined versions of them all. So imagined audition, imagined vision, imagined emotions. And so it's our ability to concoct in our minds and deliberate on imagined versions of things that is a lot of learning. And it's probable when Lance mentioned in the Fristonian model, the active inference model, that the brain is actually being a modeler, and being a modeler was not really not explicitly obvious in Blum's model, but it's the imagined versions of experiences which could be incorporated into the actual modeling process. And it's the competition between the actual perceptions related to the world and and what's produced by the model, the matching between those two in an experience sense, literally, that originates what he would call surprise, which is then used to iteratively to develop the model. So it's a really complex thing, as I was listening to the presentation, I had trouble finding all of these things in the model. Doesn't mean they're not there, because I'm not really privy to the depths of it, but the experiences, the experiential component, the experiences, to me, they're absolutely the center of it all in terms of cognition. So how successful this system would be in implementation, I'm not so sure. But if I had to guess, I would say that it would underperform in the face of novelty. And the more extreme the novelty, the worse the performance. But that's just my take on things. Well, the only other thing which occurred to me is that might be worth saying is if there was an agent constructed and it had no experience, no emotion, no vision, no audition, no olfaction, no gustation, then existence itself would be something that this thing could not comment on, because the difference between existing and not existing is undetectable. It's like being in a dreamless sleep forever, a coma. You're not really there. So an appearance of being there to a third person observing this agent might betray, might show some signs of, like we've talked about, pain, the outward appearance of something in pain to us, but in fact there's nothing going on in there. So switch it on or switch it off, it doesn't know, it can't tell the difference. So it appears to me that the consciousness part is actually it's the big deal of existing in the world. And we talked about motivation interestingly before, and in the sense that I'm actually in the process of designing something along the lines of trying to get an idea of battery life being attached to some kind of sensorum, like pain or happiness or something, in my own model, because none of the other homeostatic things make any sense. This thing does not have any um, doesn't have a vascular system or anything to be, or for example, a stomach, doesn't have a stomach. So the motivations are very different. So a machine that has similar motivations based around its own kinds of physical existence, like battery, would be the thing that is, at least in the very early versions of it, central to the life of, so-called life of this agent.
Is the key to all that the ability for the agent to recognize its own non-existence? And if it can't conceive that, all the rest is moot. There is no meaning to pain or any
what's
of
in
these
it
things.
yeah, what's in it for the agent, right? What does a reward look like to an agent who can't feel any kind of pleasure or pain or anything? What difference does it make to behave in any particular way? It's hard to conceive as a human how that could motivate, how anything could be motivated. So, I mean, it could, if it's being automated, if the motivation is automated, then it's just a piece of machinery like a toaster, and its motivation is apparent but not actual to a third person, and it could behave badly, and the agent behaving badly wouldn't care. So it's a very deep problem, and it's been interesting to see Mr. Blum's take on it. Anyway, that's pretty much everything I've got on the thing. Hope that was of some interest.
I think, Colin, you're talking about something that's called sentience.
Yeah, I always confused a bit about what sentience actually means, but it's probable that at the core of it is the experiences. Yeah.
So presumably something can be perfectly intelligent. You can have a really intelligent computer program that isn't sentient at all.
Yeah, I think you need that motive. You're right. I think you need that motivation. You're right, to have the sentient. Like you can have pattern recognition, and I think maybe I don't know. If you look at a 3D, if you look at a scene, I was just thinking, what is a scene? It's really a bunch of predictions. It's tons of predictions about all these things, where they are, what they are, how they relate to you. It's kind of like a massive collection of predictions. But then, what do you do with that?
You don't store so much pixels as little algorithms.
Yeah, you're getting a compressed view of it. The thing. This is a computer. That's a few bits in a collection of bits. Just that knowledge. And you can, but we know what pixels represent our computer. We know where the boundaries are. We know the distance. But we're predicting all that. We don't know exactly. We're just creating. And I was thinking like red. What is red? Well, it's not blue. It's not green. It's not. It's a distinct quality that is distinct from all of its other qualities. So could you represent that with a number or a collection of numbers? And then once you have these sparse representations, patterns, recognized patterns, you need this motivational system to navigate and focus attention. You have attention, motivation, and pattern recognition. And I think consciousness somehow comes from those three, kind of combination of those three.
Well, Colin mentioned internal representation. I was looking for that too. That seems to be missing of a map of the world. So, where this entity, how this entity navigates the world. And then the other that I've seen as key in other discussions is the entity's perception of time and the ability to place things in time and in relation to time. and that being the key to learning and prediction and planning. And I don't see where that comes in here.
Yeah.
Perhaps all of these things are in some way gifted by an external party. So the entity that, based on the Blum model, just comes into existence, gifted with a whole lot of a priori stuff from a designer that has some level of functioning equivalent to humans. So we could see it appearing to attend to things, and appearing to having priorities and motives and goals that are sort of implicit in having certain kinds of knowledge gifted in a design. I mean, it could function. I can see in an application. But just how good it could be, and what would, maybe within a particular niche, it might be really useful. But I suspect that if you threw some novelty at it, it might have difficulty creating new models that weren't in the gift from the designer. So,
It depends on whether the novelty was within its frame of interest, or in German you would call it its Umwelt, whether
yeah.
it's relevant or not.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, you see it in animals. Animals clearly, like an ant, can come in contact with a mobile phone and classify this object as something relevant or irrelevant to an ant, and survive the process, and still function according to an ant's goals. So from that perspective, the necessity to have a highly discriminatory and advanced capacity to categorize novelty is not necessary. So it's all about the necessities of the agent in a context, and whether or not the mistake that gets made about categorization is fatal or non-fatal. Like an ant would have trouble recognizing the oncoming truck, for example, that's about to squash it. And because of that mistake, it's then out of the picture. So, and I suppose there's a driverless car version of that story at the moment. The mistakes that a driverless car makes can take the car out of the picture pretty easily. And that is exactly the same problem, being able to discriminate novel states of affairs in the environment in a survivable way. That's here, as somebody else brought up a minute ago, the evolutionary imperative that gave us our capacities in that regard. So it's an interesting, Mr. Blum's model is an interesting model. I love looking at other people's take on all this. It's always interesting. There's 100 people giving their own version of things. There's at least 150 different ways of conceiving of it.
All of these models seem like slight variations.
Yeah.
Slight variations of. Hey, how about that? His argument about free will. I thought maybe we should touch on that before we.
Because it depend on free will.
Yeah, it sounded kind of circular to me. I think Ken might be thinking the same thing.
Yeah, he
I don't know.
seemed to drop. He sort of said, if you can compute probabilities and choose one, you have free will. And then let's talk about this other topic. So if you could explain a more cohesive version, I'm listening.
Well, it presumes it has free will in the code. If you've already coded into free will, as long as the code keeps working, it's still free. But I got the feeling that it was when a pane, for example, interceded, then it loses its capacity to act freely, because the pain is so severe. It has to, as we saw in the model, it has to change its course of action and its attention to the pain, it's not able to act freely anymore. That's the interpretation I got out of that.
Well, I think he would say that it's that slow part going up. So the answer probably doesn't come. So you make a check. You're just deciding to make a chess move. That gets broadcast down, and while they're trying to figure it out, there is a degree of freedom. Like the degree of freedom is what moves you could make, and before he's saying before that is decided, that's where free will is. It's the time before decision is made and propagates. Whether it's basically the calculating this. I mean, is it really free will? Is anything really free will?
It's a definition of not having free will is that given the same set of inputs and the logic that drives the decision, you make the same decision every time, then that's not free will, right?
Yeah.
Now, by the same token, if you introduce a coin flip in there with closely weighted choices, even that's not necessarily free will if you rely on a random number generator to decide, right?
Yeah.
It provides the appearance of free. So the illusion of free will in an AI to us is kind of analogous to our own illusion of free will if we don't believe in it for humans, right? It looks like free will, so we can interpret it as such, even though it's not really free will on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense of freedom. The degrees of freedom is a sense of freedom, but I don't know if it's true free will. I think universe is deterministic, or maybe there might be quantum fluctuations, but that also is just randomness, if it is possible. Can we end with that?
And I'm going to have to go in a few minutes because I actually have another Zoom conference at 8 o'clock. So I was just wondering if Lance would talk about his ideas about sparse distribution.
They're not really my idea. If you Jeff Hawkins, if you look up Jeff Hawkins' sparse distributed representation, there's lots of videos online. I could post. I'll post some in the comments section to this meetup. He has some interesting ideas about grid cells too, and how the neocortex might mimic some of the functionality of grid cell. And I find it interesting because grid cells kind of determine your location in a room using sparse coding. And just my internal sense that other senses have 3D position. I mean, why do other senses have 3D? I mean, I guess sound makes sense, but like, I don't know, internal voice and whatnot. Why does every sense seem to have...
I think grid cells are mostly a 2D representation, or maybe 2.5D.
They are, and they're not. It's not just. I don't think it's just your location. Like they did a study where that 2D position, like the y-axis, they had patients looking at ducks, and one was like the length of the neck, and one's like the width. So they also can represent features. So it's interesting, fascinating what grid cells.
From what I understand of grid cells is that they're only able to distinguish 2 dimensions.
I think so. Yeah, because the sparse representation gives you kind of a point in the room. Like I think an overhead view probably point in the room.
Yeah. So I would wonder if squirrels and birds have 3D grid cells.
I don't know.
No, they're.
Well, they use rat experiments. The way they learned about grid cells, they use.
Yeah, they mostly run around in 2D world,
Yeah, and they found there was a grid of that fired when they ran grid area, and basically you have multiple grids overlapping, and each cell is basically a grid, and that's how you get kind of a, not train, you get.
Well, it's an internal mapping. It's an internal representation, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Like you get a 2D input, but internally, even a squirrel can represent that in a 3D model that allows it to jump from tree to tree or something.
Yeah, and like the Blum talks about, like the taxi cab drivers in
London or something.
they have to take that big test to memorize the whole city, and their
Right.
hippocampus grows quite a bit, and so they must be I don't know. I think it's entorhinal.
Well, I think I read that a part of their brain is actually bigger. Isn't that the story?
The hippocampus grows, and it's more a matter of the size of the map. Like it's still 2D, but it's just got a lot of acuity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
chubby.
what they also found, it has to do with, they found that there's more acuity near rewards. So that's interesting. That kind of gives you it reminds me of like general relativity and gravity, you know, bending of gravity towards these rewards. Maybe that's part of motivation somehow.
So, Lance, just a couple of background
I'm going to
questions.
go now. I'm going to go now, so thank you very much.
Hey, see you next time, Jim.
Yeah.
Is I've read the HTM theory before, but it's just been a while.
Yeah.
Oh, you moved. Okay. He left and you moved. So, I think the sparse, what's the rest of it?
Distributed
Yeah.
representation.
That's Hawkins? Is that Hawkins' custom invention?
Oh, I don't think. I mean, there's been sparse distributed memories.
Yeah, I see a lot of sparse. I just thought, I was wondering if that
Hawkins made the Palm Pilot, so, and he used that sparse representation in that, and so he's developed it quite a bit since then. But he goes back a long time with that particular representation.
You hear sparse and you hear restricted thrown in a lot. I just was wondering if that variation was his.
Yeah, you're probably thinking like restricted Boltzmann machine. That's more about like
some kind of reduction. But
machine learning.
In the news, I think I saw that Hawkins was mixed up with IBM in some context.
He has a company called Numenta now, and their whole goal is to understand the neocortical columns. I mean, he thinks, I think it's kind of likely that there's a single overarching algorithm in the neocortex, because everywhere you look in the neocortex, it looks fairly similar. That would be amazing if they found that algorithm.
Yeah, Numenta is a bit secretive, but he has a book, which is quite old by now. It's maybe 15 years old or so, but pretty much describes everything we know about it, and he models the neocortex, and this all we know.
Yeah, I thought I read he was doing something with IBM, but I'm gonna I just put something in chat. I wanted to bring this up in last week's and Lance, this is what I was talking, that video. If you guys are interested, there was a guy from Cisco who talked about applied AGI, and which I thought this was a really interesting talk, because you don't often hear about mainstream companies working on AGI. And so if you're interested, it'll be here in the chat, and I'll post it. I'll post the recording as usual. I usually post the recording, so if you miss it here, you can look it up later. I'll post the chat too, if you're interested. I thought it was really interesting. It starts out a little slow, then about 15 minutes in, he starts to talk about his structure. So check it out.
Well,
A
You don't
lot
hear
of
a lot
companies
about
say they're doing AI, but
Well, so I was wondering if we had time, I was going to bring this up and we could argue about whether it was really AGI or not, or whether it was just a lot of hype and a lot of hand waving and so forth. And so whether it was basically it's a neural symbolic structure, and he's using uh, well anyway, check it out. It uses some of the NARS. Some of you guys are familiar with. Colin's probably heard of NARS. Pei Wang's
Yeah.
open source project. So he's collecting all kinds of data and aggregating it and feeding it into the NARS. From somebody from industry that's really working hard on this, and how much of it's hype and how much of it's real, how much of it'll work, I don't know. But I tend to look at a lot of these demonstrations like this pretty optimistically. So I've given it.
Remember Watson?
yeah.
Yeah. That
See, I always believe.
one of them. Yeah.
Well, anyway, this guy means business though. So I just thought it was really interesting to hear somebody, because most of us has that, like Colin, you remember 10 years ago when AGI was just like a back room, the depths of the internet on these obscure message boards.
Yeah.
And then to hear somebody from Cisco saying we're going to implement AGI.
Yeah.
So it's come a long way. At least
heard that many times, even from myself.
Yeah.
When they give the AGI stock options, then they've made it.
Well,
I just had a Ben Goertzel flashback because he sort of coined the term basically around 2005-ish. If anyone is interested and listens to podcasts, he's done a 4-hour podcast interview with Lex Fridman. So if you want to overdose on Ben Goertzel, there you go. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Well, I put today's video on a 1.5 speed. I'll put that one on 4 speed.
Yeah. There's a lot. It's good though. It's good to hear Ben blathering on. Don't catch up with him much anymore.
We see a lot of Ben's hat there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I only looked at the audio. Probably.
He would look pretty like Haight-Ashbury psychedelic. And that the last day of the conference that I thought was great for in terms of cost and ease to get to. You just sit in front of your computer. When I went in 2016. I was between apartments, so I drove from Seattle to New York for AGI 16. I spent a whole month. So this was a little easier, and it's free too. So, but anyway.
All the videos are online, right?
Yeah, the last day was a lot of you hear a lot of if you listen to AGI, future is too much. You start to believe it's right around the corner, but if you're trying to work on it though, see, actually there isn't anything. You feel like stopping and there's nothing. Actually, we got a long way to go before we get to. Because they were talking about, can a computer be compassionate?
Yeah.
Well, that's why I put out.
I mean,
that I think it's doable. So the interesting thing to me is there a conceptual blocker to AGI? But I wouldn't put a time frame. It could. Well, like I said earlier, 10 years, 1,000 years, I don't know. But philosophically, technologically, is there a blocker to think that we could get to AGI? And
well,
then we touch a little bit.
I don't think I've always thought there was no block. So
not.
I thought that, and the further along I work on it, the harder it gets. When I started off, I thought it was going to be easy, but
I'll go into my hobby horse right now, but I'm actually very helpful that AGI isn't coming on faster than we think. I'd like to see IA happen much more important than AI. I'd like to see our own intelligence augment.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could all use a bit of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worry about unemployment if there's real AGI, and robots making all the pizza and stuff. What are we
Well,
doing?
part of IA is being able to cooperate with robots, and there was quite a bit of that at the AGI conference, and that was one of the few aspects where there was a bit of IA involved. But really, if all the researchers who are doing AGI flipped over to working on IA, are even 50% of them, we would much reduce the safety issues and just make living on Earth much better.
Yeah, you might want to dose up Trump on some of that too. Yeah.
Cool. Well, you guys have a good day.
Okay. Thanks a lot, guys. Good. Got me thinking.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone. This was
Until
enjoyable.
next time.
Next time.
See you guys.